webinar. And I'm looking forward to hearing from all of them this morning. We have Ian Yates, who is the CEO of COTA Australia and has been in that role for a number of years. He's been involved in that the aged care debate, particularly for a long time now. We've got Joanna Quilty, who is the CEO of NCOS, New South Wales Council on Social Services. She represents a range of different organisations in the social services sector. And Jeremy Cooper, who is currently working for Challenger, and he's here very knowledgeable about retirement income. So we've got some great people to speak to us today. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we are all on this morning. I'm on Gadigal country in the CBD. It's where I live and I work. And I'm looking out over a really beautiful, gorgeous autumn day in the CBD this morning. But I know that we have people joining us from right around New South Wales. And so we are on multiple Indigenous lands. I'd like to pay my respect to elders past, present this morning and extend my respect to any Indigenous people who are joining us for the webinar this morning. For those of you who aren't sure, COTA stands for Council on the Ageing. We're the peak organisation for people over 50 in New South Wales. We're a policy and advocacy organisation. We work with politicians, policymakers, service providers and the media to make sure the views of older people are heard and acted on. We also provide services for older people, including the Legal Pathways Program, the Aged Care Navigator Service, and Living Longer, Living Stronger, which is a exercise program for older people. A quick bit of Zoom housekeeping before we commence. Everyone except the presenters are on mute this morning. You aren't able to unmute yourself as this is a webinar setting, not a meeting. You are, however, able to ask questions of the presenters through the Q&A panel, which is at the bottom of your screen, and you can join the chat in the chat panel also at the bottom of your screen. We're recording this webinar this morning, and it'll be available from tomorrow on the COTA New South Wales YouTube channel, along with all of our previous webinars. So as I said earlier, the federal budget was delivered about 3 weeks ago, followed by the response from the opposition, focusing heavily on aged care. But it wasn't an ordinary budget and reply. It came just before the long-awaited announcement of the federal election, and we're 2 weeks into a 6-week election campaign right now. So far, the policy debate has been muted and frankly a bit disappointing, and yet we think there's a lot that we need to be talking about. COTA Australia released their election platform this week. You'll find it on their website. And it noted several things. One, that the implementation and recommendations of the Aged Care Royal Commission are underway, but it'll take a lot more commitment and a lot more money to actually achieve the outcomes that we were looking for there. The findings of the Retirement Income Review need a more comprehensive consideration and response. Digital transformation is leaving a significant number of older people behind. Age discrimination laws are no longer fit for purpose and need revising. And for older people on low incomes, along with any other person on low incomes in the community, are struggling with the cost of living pressures, and those need to be addressed. Safe, secure, appropriate housing is increasingly unaffordable, leaving pensioners and those on other benefits living in poverty. And oral health care continues to be unaffordable for many people. And as someone who went to the dentist just this week, I can affirm that it is really expensive. So it's quite a list, but we're looking forward to hearing from our panelists on these topics this morning. So the way that we're going to run this morning, similar to other webinars, is that we'll have presentations from each of our speakers, and then we'll go into a discussion section. So if you have questions while you're listening to the speakers, please do pop them in the Q&A panel. We'll be watching those and making sure we're incorporating as many of them as we can in the discussion section. So our first speaker this morning is Ian Yates. As I mentioned, Ian is the CEO of COTA Australia, a position he's held for quite a long time now. Ian has played a national leadership role in COTA since 2002. He serves the sector on a number of federal government and aged sector national bodies. He holds a BA from Flinders University. He's a member of the Australian Institute of Company Directors and was awarded membership in the Order of Australia in 2005. Really pleased that he's able to join us in his first week back from holidays. Over to you, Ian.
Thanks, Megan. And I'll just start sharing my screen. Is that working on your side? Is that working on your side, Megan?
It is, you're right, you can go.
Okay, it's not showing on mine, but so yes, I'm going to give you a short presentation on both our federal budget analysis and on, because of the timing that, as Megan has referred to, and also on the election context, because the two are closely interrelated. So just a bit about COTA Australia. It's the peak older persons organisation in Australia. It started in Victoria as the Older Persons Welfare Council over 70 years ago. COTA Australia and the state and territory COTAs, of which COTA New South Wales is a very active member, have a large number of member organisations who reach over 500,000 people, and in addition, over 45,000 older people are direct COTA members or supporters. COTA covers a wide range of public policy areas, which I just mentioned because we're not going to get into all of them, but I can pick up on these in the discussion. Aged care, in which we've played a leading role in reform for well over a decade now. Retirement incomes, particularly pensions and superannuation and related policies. Healthcare, particularly dental, mental health, chronic disease issues, pharmacy issues, and a range more, including co-design in the health space. Housing, affordable housing, retirement living, and livable design. We've been active in all of those areas. Human rights, especially in relationship to ageism and age discrimination. Banking and other financial services has been quite a focus for us in recent years, and consumer rights. We sit on the advisory bodies for both the ACCC and ASIC. Mature employment and training and unemployment support, age-friendly communities, particularly in relation with our state and territory COTAs, transport, urban planning, and so on. And there's a lot more. We brief an incoming government on over 20 portfolio areas. And in conjunction with the COTAs, each 2 years, we produce the State of the Older Nation report. And the latest was actually last year. You can see when you reuse a set of slides, sometimes you miss something. Just make my pointer move. So we published a federal budget policy alert, which is on the website. That's the link. That analyzes in some detail the federal budget. I'll just do some of the headlines of that in today's presentation. But I would recommend that's a quite detailed presentation of what was included and then what we had asked for in our budget submission, which you can also find on the website, that wasn't included, and our analysis of the implications of the budget. But we, last week, as Megan mentioned, we issued our federal election statement. It's called An Agenda for Government from Older Australians, Policy Recommendations for the 47th Parliament. Again, that's on the website, and you can download it and look at the 37 recommendations that we have in there that cover a whole range of public policy portfolio areas. And I'll touch on some of those things because they're relevant to the budget context. So looking at the budget in the area of income and cost of living, obviously we had the $250 bonus payment. Some people have responded that that's not enough, but we would note that it roughly doubled the pension indexation for the March-September period. And so certainly is welcome for people on low incomes. Then there was the low and middle income tax offset, an additional 420, which obviously affects people in the workforce rather than people who are completely out of it. And a reduction in the fuel excise by 50% for 6 months, which not only is a direct saving if you're filling up your car, for example, but which has flow-through implications because the cost of the fuel flows through into many other items, household purchasing items. So from our point of view, they were all welcome short-term measures. But there are longer-term issues that we've been raising and weren't addressed. And we've raised these in the agenda for the next Parliament. One of them is pension adequacy for full pensioners, and most people going into the future won't be, but there will always be people who are full pensioners and who don't have significant assets and don't have other income. And I think it's appropriate that from time to time we review whether for those people the pension is adequate, not just in terms that sometimes is talked about as whether it's keeping them out of absolute destitution and poverty, but whether it is keeping them in touch with general living standards. This is not a criticism that hasn't been done, but we think it's something that we're getting a lot of feedback on that ought to be done in the next Parliament. The second are the policy settings for pension income testing and the work bonus. Since the pension was last looked at back in 2007-8, we've seen the world of work and retirement get much more blurred. And we also think that there is a real need for increasing participation rates amongst mature age workers. There are obviously discrimination issues that affect that, but there are other issues like the incentives and disincentives that our income testing and our work bonus in the pension create. So we haven't put a position about what that should be. And let me say, there are some colleagues in the broader advocacy sector who argue as if you could just abolish the income test. Well, that is not something that we would be advocating within the current context of our social security system. It would in effect be a universal pension. But we do think that those measures need to be looked at and tested with some decent research. And then there are a whole lot of other things in the retirement income review that need to be implemented. Thankfully, we saw the retirement income covenant, for which COTA has, along with others, advocated really strongly and vigorously for. We were very pleased to see that actually get through the Parliament before Parliament was prorogued, because we had some hesitations as to whether it would. And Jeremy will talk about the covenant later, so I won't in detail, but it is about focusing the superannuation system onto its real purpose, which is to generate income in retirement, not just to generate a nest egg. But there's also a lot of work to be done about getting people better advice, having them better informed, becoming more literate, and able to have a more adequate retirement income as a whole. There's a need to review superannuation taxation. There's a significant imbalance depending on your income level and the benefits and the costs to the community. Obviously, Commonwealth rent assistance is a major area that continues to not be tackled by both sides. If you're living in the private rental market on the pension, you're living in significant poverty. This has been recognised since the Harmer review back in 2008, but has not been tackled. Another thing we've argued for is the general abolition of liquid assets test waiting period for a job seeker. But if not for a general abolition of that, at least for people over 50, because not everybody has all of their retirement assets in super, which is exempt from it, but many have it in other forms, and the liquid asset test waiting period requires that they run that down if they become unemployed, on top of the fact that they're probably experiencing age discrimination. And then I probably can't pass out of income cost of living without mentioning the matter that's been in the media for days, the cashless welfare card and the pension. Just to comment that COTA has since July last year been assured that there has been no government policy and would not be on that. We've made that very clear to everybody. And that's become a bit controversial in the last few days. We don't really like to see that kind of tactic used from either side. And we are similarly not happy that we are seeing coalition supporters and coalition talking about things like death taxes, which are not Labor policy at all. In aged care, the budget contained another over 600 million for things like pharmacists in residential care, COVID, infection control, vaccination, training, other training and development, and many other measures. But one of the things that we kind of forget sometimes in budgets is that we focus on what is brand new in this year's budget, but budgets are projected ahead across what are called the forward estimates, and that's a 4-year cycle. So this budget as a whole contains all the measures that were announced in the last budget, and then in the mid-year economic statement in last December, and which is now a total of around $19 billion over 4 years in terms of implementation of the aged care reform package. That includes things like, and this is just a little list of increased home care packages that are being rolled out at the rate of about 770 a week at the moment, of 40,000 a year. The introduction of the new funding mechanism for residential aged care called ANAC, measures to strengthen both the system governance in aged care and provider governance. The launch of the Aged Care Finders program, which is the programmatic successor to the Navigators program that the COTAs have been piloting for a couple of years. There'll be 500 of those around the country, and much, much more. The implementation package for the aged care reform program covers about 72 different government projects. All of that is funded in this budget, but it wasn't a new thing, it's still there. It wasn't a surprise in this budget that workforce increase wasn't budgeted. The government and indeed the opposition are both saying that they're waiting on the Fair Work Commission outcome, which is expected middle of this year. And whoever's in government will have to pay for that, but they won't know what it is until it comes down. I would note it's not strictly a budget measure, although the provisions are in the budget for this, but the Aged Care Reform Bill number 2, the one has gone through, but that did not pass the Senate, and that's going to delay a number of important measures in the aged care reform process. There are a lot of challenges to the implementation of the government's aged care reform package at the moment. Many providers are trying to slow it all down. We are still trying to discuss with Labor their positions on the supported home program and other measures. They've announced measures aimed particularly and primarily at residential care, and they're very welcome. But we need to understand whether the pressure, if there's a change of government, whether the speed and scale of change that's in the package will be proceeded with. Legislative delays could slow it down, not only the Reform Bill number 2, but we have a very tight schedule to get to the new Aged Care Act by the middle of next year, which is important for the new supported home program. And we've had a lot of incentive in government pre-election to keep to the timetable that the Royal Commission recommended and they accepted. But after the election, there's always a chance we get some slippage. Whether or not there's a change of government, there'll be at least one new minister, probably more in government, and potentially that's a possibility of slowing things down. So apart from that, in health, we did not see any action in the federal budget on dental health, and nor have we seen it in the election so far. We've nominated as high priority. We nominated that last election. Labor did put effectively what we had recommended out to the people in the last election, but hasn't this year. Mental health services for older people has been a perennial, continuous issue for us. A lot of emphasis in mental health on younger people. Older people are significantly discriminated against in terms of mental health access, and particularly once they're in aged care. And a much better integration of primary health care with aged care is a high priority for us. Ageism and age discrimination, it's a workforce issue, obviously, as we and something that COTA New South Wales has been very concerned about, and the Human Rights Commission. But it's much broader than that. It needs a whole of government effort to tackle. as we have seen in doing things like tackling gender discrimination. And our age discrimination legislation effectively has no teeth. We need legislation that tackles age discrimination as a systemic problem, not something that's just an individual instance. And finally, digital inclusion. This is not obviously just about older people, but it's significant for many in older cohorts at the moment. We are advocating for a digital inclusion pension and benefit supplement to meet some of the cost barriers. There are other measures that need to be implemented. And one of them we came up with was that when you access government websites, which increasingly is the only way you can find out about things or apply for things, that should be free. It should not come out of your data cap. If we're required to use online, we shouldn't be required to pay for it. So that's my presentation, and I think, Megan, that's in good time. And questions and discussion will happen later.
Excellent, thank you, Ian. You did indeed keep to time. It's terrific. But I will leave the questions. I noticed there were some questions coming in for Ian while he was speaking. We'll leave those until we get to the discussion session later on. I'd like to introduce Joanna now. Joanna is the CEO of the New South Wales Council of Social Services, which is the peak body for the community sector in New South Wales. Her focus at NCOS is on developing the evidence base to contribute to sound and equitable public policy, raising awareness of the extent of poverty and disadvantage in New South Wales, the experience of vulnerable groups and the interventions that will make a difference, and ensuring a strong, valued community sector that is well placed to provide frontline support and collaborate with government for a fairer, more equitable New South Wales. Thank you very much. I know that Joanna just finished her holidays last week as well, so we've just got her back too. And thank you very much for joining us this morning. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Megan, and it's great to be joining you this morning. So thank you to you and COTA for the opportunity. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting. I'm on Gadigal land of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. As Megan said, I'm the CEO of the New South Wales Council of Social Service. Just to give you some background on who we are the peak body for the social services sector in New South Wales. We have about 450 members who are social service organisations right across the state, but also interested and concerned individuals who share our values. We also have a Friends of NCOS category, which is for government departments, councils and private sector organisations who support us. Together, we advocate for a New South Wales free from poverty and disadvantage and a strong, sustainable social services sector. Obviously, that is a really broad remit, and we are quite a small organisation. So we do make a big effort to target our focus to those initiatives that we think will have the greatest benefits for people experiencing poverty and disadvantage, but also for our sector. And of course, we absolutely collaborate. We're not a specialist peak, but we work very closely with others who have that deep expertise on particular issues and for particular groups. So peak bodies such as Homelessness New South Wales, DV New South Wales, COTA New South Wales, and at a national level, of course, that includes ACOS, and we work very closely with them on issues of national concern, including the federal budget. So in terms of our federal budget priorities, within that context, I think they can be best summarised as wanting a permanent boost for those on the lowest incomes, and specifically we were wanting to see a rise in the job seeker rate to $70 a day, and also increasing the related Commonwealth rental assistance allowance by 50%. We were also wanting to see substantial investment in affordable housing for people on low incomes, meaning substantial investment in a big social housing construction program. We were also hopeful that the budget would provide cost of living relief through affordable and accessible essential services. and we were wanting to see sustainable funding for the social services sector. So did the budget deliver? And what did we get? I think when it comes to that permanent boost to the lowest incomes, we really didn't get a lot other than that $250 one-off payment for pensioners and other income support recipients. This was off the back of an increase of $25 a week to the job seeker allowance earlier in the year. But that with that increase, job seeker still remains below the poverty line. And this is despite really widespread support from business groups, from economists, even from voters themselves. Our polling shows that the majority of people in marginal seats support raising job seeker to above the poverty line. And yet the budget didn't deliver that, and neither party is committing to that in this election. We do know that this is an issue that doesn't just affect younger people. The extension of the qualifying age for the age pension, the tightening up of eligibility for the disability pension, and the rise in insecure and precarious work mean that the number of older people in the labour force and dependent on job seeker is growing, as is the number of those experiencing long-term unemployment. Of those on job seeker for at least 2 years, we know that 46% are aged over 45. When it comes to Commonwealth rental assistance, this just has not kept pace with rent hikes. Anglicare's most recent housing snapshot paints a really stark picture in relation to this. For couples on the age pension, their data tells us that only 2% of rentals across Australia are affordable. For a single person on the age pension, 0.5% of rentals are affordable, and the situation is even more dire for those who are dependent on job seeker. So for a single person, I think it's 0.1% of, for a single person, there are no rentals that are affordable for a single person on job seeker, and for a single parent with one child, it's 0.1% of rentals that are affordable. So look, certainly the $250 one-off payment isn't going to be knocked back by anyone who is living below the poverty line and struggling to put food on the table and pay their bills, but it's going to disappear in a nanosecond and really just did not cut it. When it comes to affordable housing for people on the lowest incomes and that substantial investment in social housing that we were looking for, we didn't see it. What we instead got was an expansion of the home guarantee scheme, whereby first home buyers only need anywhere in the vicinity of 5% for their deposit. That's just not going to cut it. As we know, Australia is in the midst of a housing crisis. Lack of availability of affordable rentals is now a problem that extends across our suburbs to the outer reaches of our metro areas and into regions. It's a really widespread problem. As a result, homelessness in all its different guises is on the rise. It has been on the rise at a much faster pace in New South Wales compared to other jurisdictions, and that's only been exacerbated by bushfires, the pandemic, and now floods. We know that older women are the fastest growing group. There has been a surge in women and children escaping domestic violence and seeking support from specialist homelessness services. These services are supporting 25% more people than they are funded to support. And it's a really, really significant and concerning problem. But it is one that is dispersed. It is one that is quite hidden. Although I think when we see things like the floods in the northern rivers, that does really shine a light on and increase visibility of this kind of problem. The government at a New South Wales level, the state government's own intergenerational report tells us that an extra 68,000 social housing properties will be required for the 65 plus age group alone by 2060-61 if we continue to see the rates of home ownership declining as they are. So under a business as usual scenario, that is what is going to be needed. Yet at the same time, we're seeing social housing stock going backwards. I think we've lost something like 9,000 properties since 2014. We've got waiting lists of up to 10 years and a lot of people just basically giving up. So it is a really dire situation, and unfortunately the budget didn't do anything to address it. The Labor Party has committed to building 30,000 additional homes, social housing properties in its first 5 years. So that is promising, certainly a step in the right direction, but we would argue nowhere near enough what is actually required. When it comes to easing the cost of living and ensuring that essential services are affordable and accessible, what we got was certainly some of the points that Ian has mentioned, that cut to the fuel excise, the $450 one-off tax offset, and a reduction in the safety net threshold for the pharmaceutical benefits scheme. You know, they are all going to make a difference and households will benefit from them. One could argue they're not particularly well targeted. And I think what's disappointing is that we know that those stage 3 tax cuts, which were agreed to, I think, last year, are still going to happen. And that's going to deliver significant benefits for people who are earning over $200,000 a year, so wealthier households, whereas, say, someone on $45,000 isn't going to get anything. They're tax cuts that are costing taxpayers a substantial amount of money, which could arguably have been better spent on social housing or raising the rate of job seeker, targeting those who are really disadvantaged and well off. I think one thing that really disappointed us was that we have seen rising disadvantage over a number of years, and certainly exacerbated by COVID, and that has seen demand for essential services such as emergency relief, you know, legal advice through community legal centres, support through homelessness services, child and family services, etc. Demand for those types of services, supporting really vulnerable families in difficult circumstances, has gone through the roof, but there's no recognition of that in this budget, and there's certainly no growth funding or increased funding to help meet that rise in demand. There was no assistance to low-income households to help them with energy efficiency. We know they consume more of their weekly budget on their energy bills and would really benefit from measures like that, but they weren't there. As Ian has mentioned, no expansion to public dental services, which we know are costs that are seen as expendable in a household that is really struggling, where many people just go without going to the dentist, notwithstanding excruciating pain and other health impacts that arise from that. And as Ian made the point, I don't think there is enough recognition of digital exclusion. We've got so many of our services and supports now going online, but so many people are excluded from accessing them because they don't have the technology or the skills required to navigate systems. A lot of our social services are stepping in and helping to provide access to technology, helping to navigate complex service systems so that people in need are able to get the support that they require. But there isn't any formal recognition that that is the role that is being taken on, and this budget certainly didn't provide that recognition. And in terms of sustainable funding for the social services sector, that follows on from that need for greater investment in essential services. I think what we got from this budget was largely a continuation of existing programs. So we know that our social services are absolutely stretched to the limit, yet they are very much impacted by short-term contracts, uncertain funding, program discontinuation, lack of a consistent approach to indexation, which makes providing a stable workplace, decent wages and conditions, and certainty really difficult to do. Our sector is a major employer of women. It's a growth industry, but we know that 1 in 2 jobs are insecure, that 1 in 2 staff are saying they're considering leaving the sector, that stress and burnout are significant issues, and that there are skills shortages right across the board, and that these are only going to intensify. I think that aged care workers are a case in point. It's an ageing workforce. They're earning less than a Bunnings retail assistant, but there was no commitment in the budget, and the government hasn't come out really clearly backing in the wage case that's before the Fair Work Commission. So I think that that's disappointing, that recognition of this essential workforce that is predominantly female and that does need to be better paid and valued just wasn't there. So I guess in conclusion, from our point of view and from that of many of our members, it's very much a Band-Aid budget, providing temporary fixes, not permanent solutions. For us, it's very much a missed opportunity to undertake the structural reforms needed to address some of those really critical challenges that we're facing if we want a fairer and more inclusive Australia. I think we are seeing inequality widening and the most vulnerable being left behind, and I don't think this budget does anything to reverse that situation. That's a very depressing note to end on, but I do want to say that join NCOS. We would love to have you on board to help continue to prosecute the case for a fairer, more inclusive society. It's definitely value for money. For concession holders, it's only $5 to join. And you can then do fabulous things like attend our post-budget breakfast, where we've got the Treasurer of New South Wales and the Opposition Treasurer who will be presenting, plus a fantastic journalist moderating and a really interesting and engaging panel discussion that will follow. So I would encourage you to join, because that's, you know, strength in numbers and one way that we can turn these things around. That's it from me. Thank you, Megan.
Thanks very much. And I would spruik their breakfast as well. It's always a really good post-budget breakfast and discussion afterwards. Again, just remind you, if you've got questions for Joanna or Ian or Jeremy, who's about to speak now, please keep putting them in the Q&A and we'll get to those in the discussion section. So I'm going to introduce Jeremy now. He's the Chairman of Income at Challenger, a full-time executive role focusing on research, public policy issues and thought leadership. Prior to joining Challenger, Jeremy chaired the COTA review. You know, it's an important it's a career building review when it gets named after you. So it's called the COTA review into the superannuation system, the recommendations of which have been substantially adopted. Before his review role, Jeremy was the Deputy Chairman of the Australian Securities and Investment Commission for 5 years from mid-2004. Jeremy, like I said, works at Challenger, and we partner with Challenger. We've been doing a large piece of work on mature age employment. So we've appreciated their support, and we're really pleased that Jeremy can join us this morning. So over to you, Jeremy.
Thanks, Megan, and good morning, everybody. So as you might have gathered from Megan's introduction, my specialty is superannuation with a particular focus on retirement income. And when I look at the budget and I answer the question, well, you know, what was in the budget that related to those topics? The answer is not much. But this is going to be a fairly upbeat presentation in the sense that there's a lot of good news. As both speakers, in fact, have pointed out, the budget can't be just taken in isolation. It's cumulative. and a lot of other things happen in and around the budget that make big differences to public policy. So when we look at what this government has done in the superannuation and retirement income space, it's really quite a, and this isn't an election plug by any means, but it's quite an incredible, it's almost impossible to think that more activity could have gone on in the space. So let me sort of go through it. Let me explain some things that were thought about but not done to begin with, just to show how sort of relentless, I guess, their enthusiasm for doing things to super was. So you might remember that the underlying purpose of the 2019-2020 retirement income review was to ask the question whether the super guarantee needed to go up from 9.5% to 10%. The answer turned out to be no. Let's keep going. Let's take it up to 10%, and as far as we know, onwards to 12% by 2025. So that was a big decision. The next one was ideas about making super voluntary, or if your income was below a certain level, you're going to be able to opt out. Some members of this government were talking about really opening up super to allow young people to buy their first home. Now, what they ended up doing was increasing the ability of the existing scheme. They raised the amount that you could take out of super under the super home saver package from 30,000 to 50,000. So that was a pretty modest change as it went. And then there were other members of the government talking about giving the future fund a role in the super system in order to create a bit more competition. And as far as we know, that one has shelved. So lots of ideas floating around, but let's look at what was actually done, which really illuminates just so much things that happened that it sort of explains why there wasn't much tweaking to do in the budget in relation to super or retirement income. So let's look at what they did. So when COVID turned up, they boldly constructed at great speed a sort of an early release arrangement where you could take 2 lumps of $10,000 out if you met certain sort of basic requirements of need. They also reduced the I don't want to get too technical here, but the deeming rates for the age pension were reduced, and some other changes made there to help low income people out. And they also did what Labor did going into the global financial crisis. They reduced the requirement to draw out of a particular percentages for retirees. So we know how they work. You effectively start retirement, you're required to draw 5% of your initial savings out, and that increases over time way up to 14% when you're in your 90s. They said, because we don't want retirees pulling money out and disposing of capital at these low prices, because I think we're expecting markets to really go into a sustained drop when COVID happened. We're going to reduce all of those different thresholds by 50%. So that was a fairly dramatic change. But on top of this, they were working on a big program of change called Your Future, Your Super. And as part of this, they imposed performance tests on super funds effectively to weed out underperforming super funds. Now, I won't go into all the technical details of that, but that was a pretty dramatic change and a great step up in accountability for the system that effectively builds up your retirement income to retire on. So that was a pretty significant reform. Also, very recently, this is a measure that has been criticised for many, many years, but the requirement that you earn at least 450, or indeed because super is an obligation on the employer, it's where you have workers who earn less than $450 per month, you're not obliged to contribute super for them. And that was seen as discriminatory, unfair to people that had multiple casual jobs, again, unfair to lower income people. And this government knocked that off. So that threshold is no longer there. And this won't, of course, really take effect for some. This is for future retirees, I guess. So it's younger people with those sorts of jobs will be getting super from day one, if you like, and that will benefit them in the longer term. So this won't have a sort of big effect right now. Another measure they introduced was, again, a measure that's been kicking around for many years, but effectively an obligation on super funds to disclose twice a year exactly where the money is. What have they got it invested in? Really just as an accountability measure, and that was excellent to see that reform get over the line. They also introduced a thing called stapling. So the way this works, it's a mechanism to overcome the problem in super of just workers having multiple accounts. You often hear about people that have got 4 or 5 accounts because they've worked at different workplaces over the years. What this does is when a person leaves school or university and gets their first job, unless they make a choice otherwise, that fund stays with them from workplace to workplace. You can opt out anytime you like. It's not forcing you to be with that fund, but it's effectively a default to overcome the problem of people having 4, 5 or even more accounts. And so as you join a new workplace, the employer looks you up on a digital system. And if you've got an existing fund, that's where the contributions go. And as I say, you're able to choose otherwise if you want to. So that's a very good measure. And again, it won't fix things overnight, but in time, the syndrome of having multiple accounts just won't be a thing. Just in March, the government announced, as this came off the Banking Royal Commission effectively, but a fairly major review into the quality of financial advice with a view to basically making advice more accessible and less expensive and of a higher quality than it is at the moment. So those things for all Australians, if that review comes up with some good recommendations and then they're implemented, that will in time benefit everybody. Lastly, and Megan's just going to pop up a slide, if you don't mind, please, Megan, here. I wanted to talk, Ian signalled this, I wanted to talk in a little bit more detail about the retirement income covenant. Sounds like a little bit of gobbledygook, but really covenant is just a fancy word that's used in superannuation law, if you like, for a duty that's imposed on the trustees of the fund. So this is a new duty that comes into effect. It was only passed by Parliament in February, and it's coming into effect. It's long mooted, so it hasn't been just cooked up overnight, but it's been in the wheels of government for a long time. It kicks off on the 1st of July this year, and it effectively, for the first time, this might seem an extraordinary proposition, but for the first time, trustees of super funds have specific duties in regard to retired people who've kept their money in super, and basically the strategy that the fund has to have is really pursuing and balancing 3 objectives. They've got to maximise the retirement income that they're providing for retired members, which includes spending that capital. So this cracks into what I think Ian mentioned, the nest egg thing that the retirement income review was critical of. This is the reform that actually delivers the solution. And the second important thing about that first bullet point is that it relates to the whole of the retirement period. And for a lot of funds, this is effectively going to be a quarter-century strategy. So if you think about the age pension age is almost 67 now. So if you think of that being the start of retirement, you really just add 25 years typically to make sure that your strategy covers the life expectancies of enough members in your fund, remembering that only half the population live to life expectancy, the other half live beyond that. I know that sounds a bit complicated, and maybe we can talk about that another day. So that's a big change. Long periods of time that are going to have to be thought about by these funds. Secondly, they're going to have to manage risks better. So they're going to have to make your income last, make it more stable, and manage those 3 risks of markets going up and down. Longevity risk is the risk of you living longer than expected and running out of money. And I think we all understand what inflation is. And on top of that, they can't just lock up all your retirement savings to achieve the first 2 bullet points. They've got to provide you with some flexible access to capital if you need a new kitchen or something happens and you actually need access to some of that money. It's principles based, so the funds are going to have to work out how this all works. So that's good. It's not too prescriptive, and I predict that over time, this will have a, unfortunately, it won't benefit people who are already well into retirement, but it'll assist new retirees and certainly assist people coming into retirement to actually be able to spend the money that they effectively sacrificed, because that's what super is. It's a consumption smoothing mechanism. It takes wages away from you while you're working, just a little bit, well, I suppose 10% at the moment, and then gives it back to you for spending during retirement. It really isn't just an idea of building up all this wealth and passing it on to the next generation. That is the key theme of this. So when you hear all of those changes, and they're really only things that have been put on the table in the last couple of years, it doesn't really surprise me that the budget really didn't have much to do in the area of retirement income. So that's really, that were the remarks I wanted to make, and I'll hand it back to you now, Megan, for some questions.
Terrific. Thank you, Jeremy. That's great. We will move into discussion now, and we're going to start talking about retirement incomes because that's where we've just ended. So it's a nice segue back into some questions. Just a reminder to everyone that if you do have questions for any of the panelists, you can put them in the Q&A session panel, and we'll try and get to those during the discussion. Jeremy, I'm going to kick off with you. Ian and Joanna both mentioned the one-off payments of $250 to those people receiving government benefits like age pensions and job seeker in the budget. What, if any, other measures were included to help those struggling with the cost of living pressures?
Well, I suppose consistent with the main theme of my talk, not much. There was the slightly controversial, I suppose, reduction in the amount that you actually have to draw out of your super each year, and as I said also during my talk, Labor did that going into the global financial crisis. The minute the pandemic came, there were the similar calls. Don't force us to consume super at the standard rates. Please halve them, like Labor did before. In retrospect, of course, it's been completely the reverse of what was expected, in a sense that well-off people have become even more well-off, and sort of technically speaking, and it's always, you can always be very wise in hindsight, of course, but that measure, not only does it conflict with the intent of the retirement income covenant and other measures of people consuming their savings, but it really only benefits the well-off, but that's a hindsight judgment. But other than what you've mentioned, the $250, the $420 one-off tax offset, etc., and the fuel excise, that's really about it. But I think it does have to be put in context of all of the other stimuluses and things that have been done.
Joanna, it seems to me, and I think we talk about it a lot in terms of younger people preparing for retirement and thinking that through, that, it was a really good measure, I think, to reduce, to take away that ability of employers not to pay super for people earning less than $450 a month. But it seems to me that there's a lot we need to be thinking about in terms of jobs and how people work in terms of retirement for the future. So, the superannuation setup was set up in the 90s, and it's been criticised, I think, because it was really for, essentially white men in long-standing jobs, and the workforce has changed. What kind of things are ACOS and NCOS advocating for to, change that, I guess, and how should we be thinking about that in terms of this, not just the budget, but the election?
Yeah, look, I think, as you say, the nature of work and the makeup of the workforce has changed significantly in recent decades, and we do have many of our systems, such as the superannuation system, stuck in another era, and they really do need to play catch up. And I think we know that it's women who particularly lose out when it comes to some of these issues. So women tend to retire with much lower superannuation balances. That means often that they do need to keep working for longer. We know if they don't own their own home, if, perhaps they've been through a relationship bust up or they've never owned their own home, that puts them in a situation that has added precarity, and that they can be in dire straits. And that's why we are seeing that increase in homelessness amongst older women, because they don't have the savings, they don't have the superannuation, they have to keep working for longer, but their job situation can be very uncertain and insecure. They're facing age discrimination if they lose their job and are needing to find another one. They're competing against a much younger cohort that has, perhaps more digital skills and higher education. So they really are behind the 8 ball. That is why we are seeing this growing number of older women who are becoming homeless. And it is a dreadful, dreadful situation. And we do really need to revisit some of the fundamentals of our society so that we can be better prepared for the future, as you say.
Yeah. Thank you,
Megan, this is an absolute just pet topic of mine. In the research that we do about retirees and so on, we've uncovered a real syndrome just to support what Joanna's saying. So 7 out of 10 Australians go into retirement as some form of couple, to be married, some other form of partnership. And that makes life, you can see by the price signals that the age pension gives off, it's a lot cheaper individually to be in retirement where you're sharing costs with another person. Women have got these risks facing them. They're partly inherent. In other words, women live 3 years on average longer than men. So already you can see that they're going to be much more likely to be spending time in retirement by themselves and not in that financial partnership. So that's point number one. Point number two is typically, and this may be historic, but certainly looking at the cohort at the moment who are in retirement, men marry younger women. So that accelerates this. So the older guy is far more likely to drop off and leave the woman alone. And thirdly, and we discovered this in our research, we were looking at the data and we asked the question to a large number of retirees, are you in a couple? And we found this incredible discrepancy. Same pool of people, the men were twice as likely to be in a couple than being single. And we thought, just what's driving this? So the two factors I've already mentioned. The third one is when there's a problem, when the marriage ends, either through a divorce or a premature death of one of the partners, the women don't remarry typically. Some do, but disproportionately don't. And the men nearly always do. So there are 3 reasons why women are disproportionately, on top of all the things Joanna's just said, they've got this inherent financial risk that they really need to think more about. And this is an awareness thing than they currently do.
Yeah, but it's you shouldn't have to get married to be to be secure in retirement. So I think there's actually systemic issues that we need to be looking at to overcome that. Yeah. And there's lots of them. I mean, the fact that women get paid less throughout most of their career is problematic as well.
The gender pay gap is alive and well, and it's particularly pronounced in highly feminised industries like the social services sector. So if we can address that, we will be going a long way towards giving women greater financial security and independence.
Absolutely. Jeremy, you talked a little about some of the issues around, or in fact, Ian mentioned that not all people who are retired now are on full pensions. In fact, it's increasingly that people are on part pensions, they're supporting themselves entirely. So self-funded retirees on low to middle incomes, also on top of cost of living pressures, contending with low interest rates. Was there much in the budget around assisting people with those cost of living pressures specifically for self-funded retirees?
Not specifically, but again, going to the surrounding things, this is where the covenant will really deliver. Now, it won't be tomorrow, but it will really deliver in terms of changing the awareness around what super's for, the ability to, funds will be reaching out to retiring members and explaining these strategies that are actually about sensibly consuming, creating retirement income in the proper sense of the word, not just sitting on the capital. And that the point you're making is a lot of these self-funded retirees are asset rich by, when 25-year-olds look at them, they think, gosh, look at all this wealth. And of course, it's not being turned into income. So the retirement, the covenant will deliver there. And of course, as you spend down that capital, the age pension turns up, even for people who start retirement, which numbers we've got show that a lot of ordinary Australians are starting retirement with so much super wealth that they're not starting retirement on the age pension, but as they consume those savings, the incentive is that the age pension will be there to help you. We did some work that showed for an average, if the covenant kind of kicks into gear and works in the way it should, we thought, well, that might make people spend, instead of the minimum drawdown rate of 5% of their starting capital, they might spend, say, another 1.5%. So they've increased from 5 to 6.5 on average. And we worked out that this would give the average retiree right now, with the amount of savings that are floating around out there, about $4,300 extra a year, or $80 a week to spend. And that's got macroeconomic advantages as well. And lastly, while the government doesn't set interest rates, the RBA does, it seems clear as a day that interest rates are going up. And this is actually good for retirees. This means their term deposit rates get better, their annuity rates get better, and so on. And the people who've really been suffering from low interest rates are people who are living on safe capital like bank deposits and so on. And so this is going to be, 10-year government bonds are already over 3%. That's getting a little bit technical, but there's clearly that's going to happen. And this will be a real bonus for retirees after a very long drought.
It has been a very long time. People have been talking about it for quite some time now. Sorry, Ian, did you want to jump in there?
Yeah, can I just add to that? I agree with what Jeremy said, but in this whole space is another thing that's happening at the moment, which is a review of financial advice, and having a better literacy and better guidance is really crucial. I can't tell you how many people over the years, particularly since the GFC, retirees who I've talked to, who effectively, if I can use the term, capitalised their losses. So they withdrew their money from super because it had lost, instead of leaving it there to recover. And then they were trying to live off the interest they were getting from term deposits from that money, which is just the worst of all worlds. And we just need a much better guidance system, and that has to be an important parallel with the covenant. And I think the conclusion we've come to is that government has to get itself involved in that, as well as the trustees of funds, in terms of basic information. We have this kind of nest egg mentality about superannuation. No one ever talks about the nest egg hatching, and that when it hatches, it's supposed to generate an income for you. And as I've heard Jeremy say in other contexts, you would think that trustees never thought about the fact that their members were actually going to spend that money. They just want to keep them saving it forever. And when you get to it, you suddenly find a large lump of money that's bigger than anything you've owned except your house. You're not an investor. You don't know how to do all that. And it is a real tragedy that we're seeing out there.
It is slightly off the topic that we were talking about, but I think it is something that we get constant questions about here, is around financial advice. And the advice that we give to people is always that it's actually something you are better off paying for, so that you're getting independent advice. But Jeremy, do you think there is a role for government to roll out some spending guidance tools to help retirees make adjustments, or is that not government's role?
Well, look, I see superannuation as it's really a public-private partnership. It was a paternalistic idea by government, and a lot of the working parts, if you like, have been outsourced to the private sector. Every so often, the government's got to actually come in and make sort of step changes, if you like. And, we've seen this government, get into that space a lot. But I think that there was even in a newspaper article this week just saying how, it was being critical, but saying what great savers Australians are in vis-a-vis superannuation, but not spenders. Now, That's behavioural. You force people into a compulsory super system and tell them how great it is to save. We've been doing this for 3 decades. Soon it'll be, people will have been in this their whole lives, and we're not getting the spending messages across. So I think, there are clearly risks involved in the government getting into this space, but I think a campaign that actually helps people, because the maths and a whole bunch of behavioural reasons, fear, ill-informed fears. We saw the retirement income review really pointing out how fearful Australians are about age and healthcare costs, and that's an American idea. We actually have a thing called Medicare, and when you look at the tax transfers and so on, people are pretty well looked after, largely, certainly in relative terms, in retirement. So I think having the government get in and whether it's through Money Smart or some other channel like that, with good tools to actually show people what sort of amounts they can sensibly spend in excess of the minimum withdrawal amounts each year.
Yeah, I agree, because I think it is hard, and you're worried you don't know what the end point is, do you? We're all living longer and longer, and so the end point kind of gets further out. We might move on now to some questions about aged care. So Ian, to start with you, it was obviously a prominent component in Labor's budget reply. Can you outline some of the Labor Party's proposals with the aged care space, and how do the government and Labor's election commitments on aged care actually compare?
Yeah, so we're very pleased to see aged care reform occupy such a prominent space in the budget reply. And I've commented that we've come quite a distance now with the Royal Commission, and since 2007, which was the election of the Rudd government, when both parties went to the election without releasing an aged care policy. Both of them had them. We'd worked very hard actually with the Labor Shadow Minister at the time. But it was never released. But now we have it. I don't know that it's front and centre in all of the campaign, but it's very vigorously there, and it was raised in the debate last night. What Labor has committed is to, firstly, as has been commented earlier, made a very clear commitment that they will, if elected, go to the Fair Work Commission and indicate to the Commission that they would support a significant increase in wages without committing themselves to supporting the 25% claim. But secondly, they've been explicit in saying that whatever the Commission decides, they will fund it, which has in the end prompted the government to make the same comment that the Treasurer has said, well, obviously, whatever. I mean, there isn't anywhere else at the moment that they can go. So they've given that commitment. But then on the hot topic, really, of 24/7 nursing, the Royal Commission recommended that nursing should move to a compulsory nurses available for 16 hours, 16/7, and then move to 24/7 in 2024. Labor has committed to bringing that forward to 2023. Subsequent comments make clear that that's dependent on there being enough nurses, and that was a significant discussion last night. Also committed to implementing the extra level of minutes per resident that the Royal Commission recommended. So they said step 1, which the government has endorsed, is 200 minutes, including 40 minutes of nursing care. Step 2 is 215 minutes, including 44 minutes of nursing care. Labor has committed to do that, and around about the time that the Royal Commission recommended it would be. That seems to provoke the government, who had previously said we're still considering that, to say that they would do the same thing. And then Labor's made some commitments in the area of nutrition, which are welcome, but there are measures in the reform package. And then also measures about greater transparency, and in home care to capping administration fees, although they haven't said to what level. Both those things would be are picked up by the government package. Transparency is increased over time in the government package. Already there's a higher degree of reporting on what providers are spending as a result of increased funding into residential care. We need to see greater transparency across the board, residential and home care. But also the government's plans for the supported home program, which is to start in the middle of next year, include unit pricing, which means you don't charge separate administration. That's all built into your pricing, and then the government will contribute what they regard and what the Independent Pricing Authority, assuming the legislation finally gets passed, says is a fair and reasonable price for government to pay. So they're effectively, Labor is differentiating itself, particularly with regard to workforce, but effectively they're going in the same direction, except that we have not seen any announcements from Labor yet with regard to home care. And that's something that we have been privately and publicly pressing them on.
Okay, terrific. Thank you for that. Joanna, to you, obviously aged care is a critical part of the service system for older people, but there are a raft of other social services and programs delivered by local community organisations that help older people, particularly those who are disadvantaged or vulnerable, to be safe, supported and connected to their communities. Was there anything else in the budget for these social services that older people rely on?
Look, I don't think there was in any substantial way. We did see some increased funding. I think Ian mentioned headspace and mental health services for younger people. I think there was some additional funding for emergency accommodation for domestic violence victims. But in terms of that increase to recurrent funding for long-established programs working with very vulnerable population groups, including older people, there just wasn't recognition that there has been this increase in demand, that these organisations are always stretched at the seams, and that now more than ever, they really need that injection of funding. No, it wasn't there. And I would have hoped that the recent spate of disasters has really highlighted that these are essential services, that they really do keep people safe, supported, and in some situations alive. And that it does, as once the disaster finishes, that doesn't mean that the need disappears. In a lot of instances, it is ongoing. But even recognising the role that these social service organisations play in disaster response and recovery, and funding and resourcing that role isn't something that the federal government wants to buy into. There does seem to be a belief that if you fund down to the local government level, then you've done it. You don't need to fund below that. And I think it's those services that are closest to the ground that actually play the really vitally important role, and yet they're just expected to do it within additional resources, which are diminishing anyway. So, no.
And it's been really obvious in Lismore and places like that, hasn't it, where those services have had to step in.
Absolutely. And I think it's going to exacerbate the workforce shortage. We know that 66% in our recent survey said that stress and burnout is a major issue for them, and 1 in 2 said we're contemplating leaving the sector. So workforce shortages are a problem now, and it's only going to get more significant. Yeah.
Okay, I thought we might move on now to talk a little about some of the issues outside of retirement incomes and aged care. So we know that older people on JobSeeker are struggling. And for those that are renting, it's almost impossible. And I think, you know, we've just talked about flooding and Lismore and other places, but in those places we are hearing there are really significant issues now. There were issues before, affordability was difficult before, but when you take that number of houses out of the market, it's exacerbated significantly. Was there anything in the budget or the budget reply to tackle this? And do any of the parties address this inequality in their pre-election platforms? I'll start with you, Joanna, on that.
Well, no, we didn't see the substantial increase to JobSeeker that we need. We didn't see the substantial investment in social housing that we have been asking for, and that many others also agree is absolutely vital and necessary. So I think for those in really precarious situations, things just have not got better. And we know for older people that can often mean they are living in isolation. They are living really dire, they are in dire circumstances. And it's often our small, local, place-based organisations who are trusted, who are reaching out, who are connected to them, but they're not necessarily funded to do that. So it's a situation that I think flies under the radar. It's not necessarily visible. Things like the floods in Lismore do actually lift the lid and show us how many are in these really precarious and dire circumstances. But yeah, I think improving the rate of job seeker would have been the biggest step that we could take to improve fairness and inclusivity, and it was a missed opportunity. We saw during COVID how increasing the job seeker rate made such an enormous difference to people really struggling. Meant they could put food on the table, meant they could afford to go to the dentist, get their car fixed, buy shoes and clothes,
prescription medicine. Yeah,
exactly. All the things that they go without, the essentials, the things that the rest of us take for granted, they could actually afford to do it. It took the pressure off, it relieved their mental health, it delivered so many benefits, and it was money that went straight back into the economy. So it was actually a great stimulus measure, but we just don't see it, and I think it's incredibly disappointing.
There's also been questions in the Q&A panel about rent assistance, which both you and Ian mentioned earlier. I mean, there was obviously no increase in the budget. I haven't heard anything myself in the election policies at the moment. I mean, this has just fallen so far behind. Like, is there an amount that NCOS and ACOS are asking for that to be increased? And do you think it actually alleviates it, or is it just, promote landlords to put rent increases up further than they are already?
Ian, why don't you go first?
Okay, Megan, it is complex, and the Retirement Income Review made that point. I mean, obviously they're talking about a particular cohort, but in general, we've had extensive discussions with the Grattan Institute. We've worked a lot with Grattan Institute on this. One point the Retirement Income Review that we would all make is that you can't just solve that issue with a rental subsidy. There's a whole range of housing measures that have to be in place, which includes more social and community housing, and a whole range of measures to take the heat out of the housing market as a whole, because those things then ripple out. But in the meantime, we had earlier argued for 40%, which is more recently we've lifted that to 50% increase in the Commonwealth Rental Assistance, making the point that where we really need to target is the private rental market, which is, for reasons I won't go into hugely, but is actually a tricky thing for the Commonwealth to target, because quite a lot of the Commonwealth Rental Assistance goes in to support things like community housing and a variety of other retirement living arrangements. And if that was all increased 50%, then you're talking a very substantial number of billions when we're trying to target that particular group. What the work we've done indicates that actually to make a big impact, because the Retirement Income Review comment was about the 40% proposal, you'd have to double it. So obviously you need to find a mechanism that enables you to target it. But really, you just end up chasing your tail unless you deal with those other structural issues. And one level this is easy to do, but I think housing is an area that lends itself more than many others to the need for a really strong national strategy, because there are Commonwealth levers, there are clearly state government levers, there are local government levers, there are industry supply issues, there are all sorts of different interests that are served well by the current situation that have to be being addressed. And you need all those levers working in the same direction, so that you're not just looking for one instrument to tackle it.
That's it. And I think this is another one of those issues that really goes right across age groups, and yet we tend to weaponize it between age groups rather than actually look for solutions that would work for people across the lifespan. Moving on to health, because I'm really conscious that we're running out of time, and I suddenly feel very much for Joan when I ask her to do this regularly. Access to specialists and GPs, particularly in regional and rural areas, is a major issue, again, across the age span. Can anyone discuss the different parties' approaches to improving access and affordability to medical services in areas outside metropolitan Sydney, where we know health indicators and outcomes are just so much worse? Throw it to Ian. Did you look like you were about to jump in there?
I wasn't necessarily, but I mean, I agree it's a significant issue. You know, government has thrown quite a lot of money at it, but it's more than a money issue. I think it's interrelated with regional development generally, because just throwing money means you'll attract people for a short period of time, but you've actually got to have people who are committed to doing it, and it goes to local recruitment and training, which is certainly something that I know some aged care providers have in more recent years learnt, that if you can actually build local employment, then you retain those people a lot longer than trying to attract and import labour. But it is a challenge for a whole lot of reasons. I would say, in terms of both aged care and health, that we just have to accept that the price of delivering those services in rural and remote areas, the unit price is going to be higher. Yeah. And you build that in. Now, that's more built in health than it is in aged care, but hopefully in aged care, the new independent pricing authority will be given the license to do that. But you've got to say it's part of the normal cost of doing business. And in the overall scheme of things, particularly I'm familiar with it in aged care, to pay significantly more for those services in those areas doesn't impact the overall, because of the size of the aged care budget anyway. Yeah. So you need to be able to be much more tailored than traditionally aged care has been.
Yeah.
So Megan, could I just add that some research that we undertook with NatSem a couple of years ago, looking at mapping the patient experience of access to healthcare and specialist services, showed that our universal healthcare system isn't in fact universal, that unemployed people and people on low incomes and those in regional areas particularly miss out and often go without because they can't afford the specialist fees, the gap fees, let alone whether or not the services are actually available in their area. And I think this also speaks to that need for greater access to technology and building up people's skills in using digital and online service provision, so that we do have more equitable access. Because I think online telehealth is great. It's not the solution for everyone, but it can assist, provided people are able to get online and to participate in that way.
Yeah, we had a question there because it was that telehealth thing was so important for people during lockdown, but in fact there are so many opportunities to use that more broadly, I think, and we're missing out if we don't do that. I just want to ask you, Joanna, before we move on again, about dental services. It obviously continues to be a major issue. I joked with all of you before we started that I went to the dentist yesterday. It costs a fortune, and you know, I'm lucky to be in the position where I can pay for that, but it's an important part of healthcare. Many people choose not to have dental services performed regularly because of the cost. It was in the Labor Party platform at the last election. It hasn't been announced so far in this election. Do you think there is any likelihood that it will be? You know, I mean, it's obviously going to cost money, but I feel like it's like a lot of preventive health services that it saves money in the end. Do you have any indications that there might be announcements around dental healthcare?
Look, I don't. We did have some success at a state level in getting a mobile public dental service rolled out to schools in more disadvantaged locations. And I think that has actually delivered results. There is data that shows that it really is having the impact that we want it to have. It's such a fundamental service. It relates to a whole range of other health issues, but we know that it is the one thing that people cut back on, that they see as an optional extra because they just cannot afford it. It causes enormous pain, and also I think issues of embarrassment and shame if your teeth are causing you grief. So I would absolutely love to see it as part of the election platform, but it does seem to be missing in action. Ian, you are probably more in the know there.
So I don't have an indication that it will be announced. What I can say, Megan, is that remind people that in terms of a scheme aimed at older Australians, that was a recommendation of the Aged Care Royal Commission. And I am aware that it was seriously considered in the context of the government response. It didn't make it in the end. It wasn't cheap. And as we both said, it was part of Labor's platform at the last election. We worked very closely with them at that time. The only positive news I can say is that so far it's not been ruled out, whereas many of the other things from the last election have been ruled out. Yep. No one said to us, no, it won't happen. So I'm continuing to raise it. I just want, in the context of our audience, to remind people that back in the Whitlam government, when the original Medibank was introduced, which then went backwards a bit, but then became Medicare, that in the original platform and design, dental was supposed to be part of it. And it didn't get up, and it didn't get up for two reasons. One was it was an awful lot more at the time, and Medibank was going to cost a lot anyway. And secondly, while there was a lot of doctor resistance to the Medibank Medicare thing, which these days they've swung right around, but there was a lot of doctor resistance. The resistance to being socialised, as they put it, from the dentist was even stronger. And what that means is that today we have a health system which, while it's not, Joanna's pointed to the weaknesses of its universality, but in a principle we have a universal health system supplemented by private health insurance. In dental is carved right out of that, as if it's nothing to do with your health. And yet it is so fundamental. And the older you get, the more oral and dental health issues impact on all sorts of other aspects of your physical and mental health.
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
So long overdue.
We've got one here in the Q&A panel, and I might throw it to you, Jeremy. The point is being made that we're talking about a lot of costs here, but with all the costs relating to COVID, how do you think some of these additional services and benefits would be paid for? Do you have some ideas around that in terms of, are we expecting into the future higher taxes, inflationary measures, higher taxing with retirees? What other measures do you think might, certainly haven't been announced so far, but into the future occur to kind of drag back some of that deficit that we're seeing at the moment?
Well, I'm stepping outside my day job a little bit here, but just, with my personal hat on, I think what we've just been shown, and we've been shown it, after the Second World War, the GFC, and now this crisis, is this phobia on deficits and who's going to pay for this and taxpayers' money. I suppose it's under the rubric these days of modern monetary theory, but governments can help the private sector by spending and stimulating the private sector when it's needed. Now, overall, you've got to keep things in balance, but I'm far from convinced that, my balance sheet, I can't print money, so I have to be, really careful how much I spend, but they've wallpapered it over, but there's been massive printing of money in Japan. Started it after the GFC. The Americans have been doing it massively. And now we've had, you won't hear many politicians saying this, but we've absolutely been printing money. And look what it's done for us. The government has played the role that it should have played in stimulating the private sector, and so we're going to see all this hand wringing and reining in the deficit and so on. But it actually, so long as you keep the whole thing in balance and you don't print money when you don't have the labour and products to support it, then things can go seriously wrong. But I think that just listening to the discussion about dental care, of course that ought to be subsidised.
Exactly. I am very conscious that it's 12 o'clock, but I don't want to wrap up until we talk about how people can actually help influence changes to policy. It's we only get an election every 3 years. Ian, what is COTA planning and how can people get involved?
People can get involved. I obviously would encourage anyone interested to join COTA New South Wales, and provide that link, but they can also go onto our website and join up and get regular information from us as long as they want to do that. There are opportunities to be involved at policy groups at state and territory level, and we encourage people to be involved in times like budgets and federal elections. We will be, I might just say, we are expecting to run some Facebook Live events with a number of federal ministers, including Jane Hume, who's in this space we've been talking about today, particularly in superannuation, but also aged care and other areas. And we expect to have them with both the ministers and the relevant shadows, and we have a number of them accepted. So have a look on our website, we'll be announcing those. But also, I mean, people should grab hold of things like our policy platform and raise it with the candidates. Make an issue, send an email, make a phone call.
Go to one of those morning teas they put on everywhere. What about you, Joanna? What would you suggest?
Well, I would suggest that at the same time that you're joining COTA, why not also consider joining NCOS?
I promise we'll send that website out with the email afterwards.
If you're on a concession, it's a $5 fee. I mean, what could be better value in this day and age? And you do get access to a whole range of different forums where you get information, where you can have input into our policy and strategy development. We run webinars, we run opportunities for our members to get together and discuss these kinds of issues, opportunities to meet with politicians directly. In the last state by-elections, we interviewed candidates in the key seats, and we'll be doing that again for the state election, which is when we tend to get particularly active. So a whole range of activities where we really value the input of members and people on the ground who bring different experience and perceptions and insights. So yeah, things will be gearing up. It is it's state election in 2023, so it's an exciting year.
It is, always. Well, look, I need to finish, and like I said, I have a new empathy with Joan right now, seeing as we are 3 minutes over the time I said that we would finish at. I want to thank very much our panelists for joining us today. It's been a really great discussion, and your expertise has been highly valued while we've been talking today. We'll be sending out to everyone an email tomorrow linking you back to the YouTube channel if you want to have another look, but we'll also put the NCOS membership page on there for you, also the COTA website page, so that you can all come on and join. Remember that this is a series of regular webinars. We're doing these once a month now. Next month, we'll be launching our new 50+ report, which will look more broadly at the kinds of things that older people are talking about, particularly in the context of the federal election, but also thinking through in the lead up to the state election next year. Remember that you can always book a community speaker if you'd like to do that on a range of topics. You can do that through the website. But thank you again for joining us today. It's been really great to have people on board. You can catch up again on the YouTube channel. And I'm going to stop talking now because it's 12:04. Thank you very much for your time today. See you next time.
Thank you.
Thanks, Megan.
Thank you.